I can still feel the crisp bite of the wind on my cheeks when I think back to that day on the frozen lake. I had gone ice fishing plenty of times before, but this trip was different from the start. There was a certain hush in the air, a stillness that made every shuffle of my boots echo like thunder. My plan was simple: head out to a remote spot on the lake, catch some fresh fish, and enjoy a quiet day away from the buzz of daily life. But from the moment I parked my truck by the shoreline, I sensed that I was not truly alone out there. Thick layers of snow blanketed everything in sight, and the world felt like it had been painted in different shades of white and grey. After a few hundred steps onto the frozen surface, I began to question my own judgment. The usual spots where anglers gathered were empty, as if everyone else had decided that the lake wasn't safe, or perhaps they knew something I didn't. Still, I pressed on, each step making a gentle crunch against the wind-packed snow. My breath fogged in the air, and my pulse drummed louder with every yard I covered. I first noticed the shack when I was nearly on top of it. The structure was small, made of dark, weathered planks that looked as if they had seen many winters. It stood on the ice like an old sentinel, battered yet steadfast. At first glance, I thought it was abandoned. There were no lights, no signs of recent human activity, but a closer look told me it wasn't quite deserted. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. I saw footprints in the snow, though they were faint and half filled with powder. My curiosity outweighed my caution, and I decided to investigate. Inside, the shack was dimly lit by weak sunlight filtering through a fogged-up window. There was a narrow bench on one side, a small space for a stove on the other, and in the center, a round hole cut into the ice. The hole was carefully lined with old boards, presumably to keep the ice from cracking further. The opening was wide enough for fishing lines, but not much else. My first impression was that this was a typical ice fishing shelter, albeit a lonely one. A slight draft forced itself through the thin walls, carrying the scent of old wood and damp winter air. I set down my gear, took out my auger, and began drilling a fresh hole next to the one in the center. I planned to spend the afternoon there, safe from gusting winds. As I started unpacking, I noticed scratches etched into the wooden walls. They ran vertically in neat rows, like tally marks. Some were faded, while others looked fresh, the wood still raw where it had been scored. They were too deliberate to be random damage. I touched them, counting them absent-mindedly. I reached a total of 20 marks before I realized how unnerving they were. Shaking off my unease, I reasoned that someone might have tracked their daily catches or simply passed the time by carving into the walls. Not wanting to dwell on it, I turned my attention to rigging my line. The soft hum of the wind outside was strangely lulling. An hour passed without any real sign of fish, and I found my mind drifting. My eyes flicked to the shack's entrance. It was still slightly open, letting in a ribbon of icy air. I stood up, intending to close the door. That's when I heard it, a gentle tap from somewhere beneath the floorboards. I paused, heart thumping. The sound was so faint I wondered if I had imagined it. Then it came again, tap, tap, like knuckles rapping from underneath the ice. I looked down at the wide fishing hole in the center, but all I could see was the dark water below. It was too murky to discern anything. Certain I was alone, I told myself it must have been the ice expanding or contracting. Winter can make the lake sing in strange ways. Yet I couldn't shake the growing tension in my stomach. In an attempt to calm my nerves, I went outside for a moment. To my surprise, I spotted footprints around the shack that I hadn't noticed before. They were small, almost childlike, and encircled the shelter in a loop. I had to squint to see them clearly. Each step was placed with odd precision, and then the trail vanished near the far side of the shack where the wind had drifted more snow. They did not appear to come from my boots. I looked around in every direction, searching for another person. Nothing moved out on the lake. The vast sheet of ice was empty, and the sky above was a uniform grey. Feeling uneasy, I retreated to the shack. The interior felt different now. It was darker, even though the light outside hadn't changed. The silence was unsettling. I sat back down, telling myself I was being overly imaginative. My plan was to fish for another hour, maybe 2, then pack up and head home. But the lake had other ideas. Just as I started to settle, that same tapping echoed from beneath the floor. This time it was louder, like something knocking to come in. I stood and examined every corner. The shack was so small, there was nowhere to hide, no compartments or storage chests. I peered down the main hole again, but the water was still and dark. My breath caught in my throat when the tapping resumed, each knock timed with the racing of my heartbeat. It felt as if it was communicating in some unknown pattern. Suddenly, the wind rose outside, rattling the thin walls. Snow started seeping under the door, carried by a sharp gust. The temperature in the shack plunged. My hands shook, but I tried to focus on my fishing line. Maybe I could at least catch something before leaving. That's when I felt a vibration beneath my boots. It wasn't just a gentle quiver, it was a rumbling, as though something under the ice was shifting in the depths. It happened so quickly that I nearly fell from shock. A heavy thud right below me. The entire shack shuddered. The lantern I had set on the bench toppled, rolling across the floor. I heard the boards creak, and ice chips drifted into the holes. For a moment, I was sure the ice was about to fracture completely. Heart hammering, I grabbed my lantern, but it refused to light. Darkness swelled in the corners of the shack. Gritting my teeth, I forced the door open and stepped outside, my gear forgotten. The winds were ferocious, cutting through my layers of clothing. I tried to steady my breathing, but my lungs ached from the cold. I planned to make a beeline for shore, leaving the shack behind. Yet as I backed away, I heard the sound of nails scraping along the planks inside. It was faint but unmistakable. My mind conjured images of someone or something inside that shack, dragging its fingers across the wood. I took a few shaky steps away and then turned back. The door was swaying on its hinge, half open. My footprints were already filling with drifting snow. Adrenaline warred with curiosity. Against my better judgment, I called out a simple greeting. My voice was lost to the wind. But in that moment of stillness, I swore I heard a soft rasp, like a response just beyond hearing. Then the door banged shut, as a gust of air swept across the ice. As I made my way toward the distant shore, I risked a glance back. Even in the encroaching twilight, I could still make out the dark outline of the shack. There was a shape in the doorway, difficult to see clearly. It might have been a trick of the light or my imagination, but it looked like a person standing there, watching me leave. My heart pounded so loudly I could hardly think. The figure remained unmoving, a single silhouette against a background of white. By the time I reached the safety of my vehicle, dusk was settling. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my fingers were nearly numb from the cold. I looked out over the silent lake one last time. The shack was barely visible in the distance, with no sign of that figure in the door. Yet the feeling of being observed lingered, like I had been judged and found lacking. I never went back to retrieve my gear. Something in me refused to risk another trip onto that ice. People asked about my fishing rods and lantern, and I made vague excuses. In private moments, I found myself tracing patterns on a spare piece of wood, wondering if they matched the marks I had seen etched on the shack's walls. In the sleepless hours of the night, I could still hear the tap, tap from beneath the floorboards. Sometimes, I think about that dark opening in the ice, how I leaned over it and stared into the water, not realizing that something might be staring back. I find myself grateful that I left when I did, thankful that the only evidence I have is a half-remembered glimpse of footprints and the echo of knocking sounds that still fill my nightmares. Wherever that shack stands on the frozen lake, it feels like it holds on to secrets meant to be left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself drawn to an empty fishing shelter on a deserted stretch of ice, be cautious. Something might answer if you knock, and if it does, you might not like what you discover lurking in the silence beneath the frozen water. Thanks for watching. If this story gave you chills, please hit that like button and subscribe for more eerie creepypastas. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.